When you study naval history long enough, it's not uncommon to find ships serving multiple navies. This was especially prevalent after the 1940s when the United States sold off tons of ships, and the British did the same, although to a lesser extent. However, few ships have quite as interesting an origin story as Japan's first ironclad. That ship, Kotetsu, which incidentally literally means ironclad, had a weird story. Originating as a French-built warship for the Confederate States of America, that then ended up in Denmark before finally being transferred back to the Confederacy, only for the American Civil War to end before she could arrive, causing the ship to end up in Union hands before being sold to Japan, where she would have an exciting start to her life before things quieted down. If ships could talk, Kotetsu would have quite the story, in several different languages. A story that started in a French dockyard in 1863. Even at this stage of her life, this ship was proving to be interesting. First off, this was a very secretive project, and understandably so. If the Union got wind of the French building ships for the Confederates, well, the diplomatic fight would be a mess. Not to mention violating French neutrality laws. Even so, the plan went forward with support from higher up, something that might have gone all the way up to the French Emperor Napoleon III himself. I've certainly seen sources say as much. Either way, in 1863, a French shipbuilder, one Lucien Armin, began to build ships for the Confederate Navy. Since it wasn't possible to state that outright, there was a certain level of subterfuge involved, just like there had been with the British, and a rather more famous ship, CSS Alabama. In this case, it involved hiding who the actual buyer was. The two ironclad rams were going to be sold to the Egyptians, not the Confederates. Armin was building ships for Egypt, honest. Of course, even a cursory glance would have one wondering where Egypt, of all countries, found the money to buy a bunch of ironclads. Sure, the Egyptian government wanted ironclad warships, but a British shipbuilder was doing the exact same thing, trying to pass off two ironclads as Egyptian orders, which naturally means the Egyptian government, and you can't see my air quotes right now, was purchasing 4 ironclad rams, 2 each from Britain and France. This would naturally arouse suspicions. Nonetheless, the construction continued. Armin built the ships under the Egyptian names Cheops and Sphinx. Both were laid down in 1863, and both were launched in June 1864. However, they would not be sold to either owner, not the fake Egyptian order, and not the real Confederate order. A whistleblower in the form of a shipyard clerk marched into the U.S. Minister office in Paris, holding documents implicating Armin's contact with Confederate agents, among other things. The French government was, as a result, forced to step in, just like the British with the layered ironclad rams that I mentioned earlier. The Confederate ships were not allowed to be sold, at least not to their original buyer, so that left Armin in a bit of a bind. There was quite a lot of time, money, and work put into these ships. Fortunately for him, buyers appeared. Denmark and Prussia were at war in 1864, so Armin went full salesman and sold 1 ship to each side. Cheops would become the Prussian SMS Prince Adalbert. The ship wouldn't arrive until after the war with Denmark, although she would end up having minor roles in the Franco-Prussian War. As for Sphinx, she became the Danish, I know I'm going to butcher this, but Sterkolder? I'll put the name on screen as well. However, the ship wouldn't actually serve under this name either. While the ironclad left France on a shakedown cruise on June 21st of 1864, there were issues. Not with the ship, but with the order. There was a lot of arguing back and forth over pricing and other such things. Ultimately, the Danish shakedown cruise sailed to Copenhagen, arriving in November of 1864. So our friend is now in Danish service, right? Well, not really. With the war against Prussia over, and lost for that matter, the Danes decided they didn't really want the ship anymore. Without ever entering proper service, the Ironclad was sold off again to the Confederates, because apparently the Danes didn't care as much about annoying the Union government. As a result, the Ironclad was sold off at the start of 1865. On January 6th, a Confederate crew took command of the ship in Denmark. Now bearing the name CSS Stonewall, the Ironclad was back with her original buyer, after a year and a messy sail. Now what did the Confederates actually get for their trouble? They got a small but capable ironclad warship, displacing about 1,400 tons at a length of 186 feet or 57 meters. On that displacement, the ship carried a relatively light weapon load, a single 300-pounder or 10-inch rifled gun on the bow. This was a muzzle-loading weapon mounted in an armored position, sometimes described as a turret, although this isn't entirely accurate. The armored box was fixed in place, with the gun doing the rotating. As you can see on this diagram, there was a track inside the turret. The gun would rotate on this to fix firing positions. The diagram shows 3, but pictures of the ship show what look like 2 more gun ports. Regardless, since these are often called turrets, I'll call them that as well. In any case, the second not-quite turret was mounted to the stern. This carried 2 smaller 70-pounder, 6.4-inch rifled guns. Both of these were also muzzle-loaders. Due to the small size of the ship, these only had 2 firing ports each, facing towards the bow and facing towards the stern. This meant the broadside was limited to 2 guns. This wasn't a terrible thing because this was an ironclad ram. The main weaponry wasn't the gun. It was the massive ram bow that you can quite clearly see here. And Stonewall was quite capable of using this, at least in theory. The ship could get up to 10.5 knots on 1,200 indicated horsepower, with 2 boilers powering 2 steam engines, and, as you'd expect, 2 shafts. This in addition to a sailing rig as well. That aside, the last thing to make note of is the armor protection. Stonewall had an armored belt 4.5 inches thick of tough iron plating, backed by 15 inches of teak. Alternatively, a 4.7 inch thick iron belt. Sources do differ on this topic. Regardless, with that rounding things off here, let's pick up where we left off. Now flying the Confederate flag, Stonewall sailed towards home. Or attempted to. She had to make multiple stopovers, including 50 days in Spain, to repair storm damage. This delayed her proper departure until March 24th, 1865. Still, Stonewall set off once more, only to be shadowed by 2 Union warships, the frigate Niagara and sloop Sacramento. The 2 wooden-hulled warships avoided an actual fight. They certainly had the firepower advantage, but the Union ships lacked armor. And as CSS Virginia had handily demonstrated, armor made up for quite a lot. So their captains declined an engagement, and Stonewall went along her way, eventually arriving in Havana in May, where she would remain when the Civil War came to its end, which means that Stonewall had technically served with her actual owner, but she saw no combat. With that owner gone, the ship was handed over to Spanish authorities, or more accurately, sold to them by the ship's captain, Thomas Page. The Spanish, having no use for the ship, promptly handed her over to the United States. which means that Stonewall has now gone through 4 owners: the Confederates, the Danes, the Spanish, and the United States. Not that the victorious Union government had any more idea what to do with her. They simply laid the ship up in the winter of 1865 while sorting out more pressing issues. Stonewall would remain in the Washington Navy Yard for a couple years, largely forgotten about, until in 1867 a new and unlikely buyer showed up: the shogunate government of Japan, looking to modernize their fleet. They found Stonewall laying there and would make an offer for the ship. This came out to $400,000. Unfortunately, inflation calculators typically don't go further back than the early 20th century. But that's still going to be millions of dollars in today's money. Now on to her 5th owner. The ship was renamed Kotetsu. Japanese is a very fickle language to directly translate, but this is typically translated as some flavor of ironclad. So with her very literal new name, Japan's first ironclad sailed off. She went on a long voyage across the Pacific, arriving in Japan in 1868, only to once again end up in a sticky situation. The simmering civil conflict between the shogunate and the imperial court had come to a head. Japan was now in the grips of the Boshin War. With the United States government neutral in this conflict, they hung on to Kotetsu. The ship had sailed with an American crew, and that crew, under orders from home, held on to the ship. Kotetsu would have to wait until the imperial forces were clearly the victor. As a result, the ship was only handed over in early 1869. If you want to be technical, that would be her 6th owner. If you count the 2 Japanese governments, shogunate and imperial, as 2 different owners. It could even be the 7th owner if you really want to stretch things and count the French as the first one. Regardless, Kotetsu was now the flagship of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and it wouldn't take long for her to finally see combat. Because while most of Japan was under imperial authority, that did not apply to Hokkaido, or at the time, Etso. There, the remainder of the shogun's fleet had consolidated as the Republic of Etso, and Kotetsu led the new Imperial Japanese Navy against their forces. This didn't go entirely to plan. Before she set sail, Kotetsu had one of her smaller guns replaced. The ship now carried 2 6-pounder and 4 4-pounder guns in its place, along with a Gatling gun of all things. The big 300-pounder and the other 70-pounder remained, but they won't be relevant here. While anchored off Miyako Bay, the ironclad was attacked on the night of May 6, 1869. The shogunate forces rammed an ex-Prussian corvette, Kaiten, into the side of Kotetsu, after reportedly using an American flag to sneak in close. Even with the element of surprise, this was a failure. That Gatling gun was used to great effect, pushing away the shogunate borders. Kaiten withdrew, and Kotetsu remained in imperial hands. She would then lead the imperial forces in the naval battle of Hakodate. This went well for the Imperials, and along with the land portion, saw the final defeat of the Tokugawa loyalists. However, this also marked the end of Kotetsu's usefulness as a frontline warship. By 1871, she was a third-class warship, renamed Azuma on December 7th. And by 1873, the ship was generally considered obsolete and not worth much in a fight, only a decade after she was laid down. Although this isn't surprising. Technology was marching on, and Azuma had been a very specialized kind of ship to begin with. Either way, the ship was only used for guard duty after this. She also ran aground during a typhoon in 1874. Beyond that, Azuma served as a guard ship during the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877. before ultimately being decommissioned in 1888 and scrapped in 1889. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.